Well, good morning again. We're starting a new sermon series that Amanda introduced so beautifully for us this morning, and I had never thought about the Grinch, but I like that a lot. It took me a very long time to feel like I started to be able to wrap my head around the Apostle Paul. I mean, here we have someone who, after the Gospels, is the biggest chunk of the New Testament, responsible for letters or credited with writing letters. Maybe some people wrote in his name. But so much of the Bible and so much of Christian theology has been shaped by Paul. He has been described as one who no one outside of Jesus has ever been more influential in the Christian faith, even today, than Paul of Tarsus, or the Apostle Paul. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time over the next few weeks leading up to the season of Lent talking about Paul. We're going to be looking at some of the journeys that he was on. We're going to be using some footage from the trip this past year, the pilgrimage that some of you were on, and a trip that I was on the year before, sharing some footage from those places so you can have a better understanding or a visual grasp of what we're looking at. And we'll be talking about the different situations that Paul encountered, some of the things that came up, some of the people that he interacted with, and tell his story that way, in a way that I hope really comes alive for all of you. And I hope that at the end of this series, you have a better grasp or an enhanced grasp of where you are today, of Paul and his ministries. And his ministries are divided into what are called the missionary journeys. And so we'll be starting today, we'll do an overview of journey number 1, and then we'll really get into journeys 2 and 3 as we go through this series. So we're going to try some new tech this morning also. And so Jay's going to put up on the screen, we're going to be, yes! We're going to be working off a map here. And I want you to see the big map before we zoom in, just so you can get your bearings. You see over on the left side, you see the boot of Italy and Sicily down there. Then you kind of have in the middle of the map, you have Greece in this area, and then you have this area which was known as Asia Minor. And then you have down here, we have Jerusalem. Down here is going to be Cairo. Rome is up here, and so forth. All right? So you got the gist of it. We're gonna zoom in now, and I want to show you where Paul is from. So Paul is from this place here called Tarsus. And Tarsus is a unique city in the Roman Empire because, and you may remember this from a series we did 3 years ago, Tarsus is a unique place because it's one of the handful of cities in the empire where, because this area is so successful, because it's so essential on trade routes, because the commerce is good, and Rome really likes this city has the special designation of paying different kinds of taxes, lower taxes, and those who are born in this city are citizens of the Roman Empire, which means that basically Paul, being from Tarsus, has a passport, so to speak, that allows him to travel throughout the empire without being harassed. That will make some of the journeys that he's about to take possible, and it will also make some of the privileges that he has extended along the way possible as well. So he is from this area called Tarsus, but he spends, after his youth, he moves down to Jerusalem, and he studies as a really outstanding Jewish student. He goes and studies under the tutelage of this famous rabbi named Gamaliel. And Gamaliel is known far and wide throughout the region in this time period as being one of the preeminent rabbis of the day, one of the great teachers. And so he is a disciple of him. Paul is a disciple of his. Now, Paul, at this time, is wanting to make a name for himself. He wants to become a well-known figure. He becomes a Pharisee. He is well-versed in all things Scripture and the law. And he is one of these guys that, like many of us who came out of seminary, we came out just guns a-blazing with our ideas and our rock-solid theology, and we're ready to see the world in a very kind of black and white way of this is how you do things, this is what you don't do, and so forth. And Paul very much falls into that category. He comes out, and he has a deep understanding of Judaism, but it's of a particular kind of, in a particular kind of lane that he is in, and he does not have sort of the more comprehensive or the wide-angle view of Judaism that, say, Jesus did. And so he ends up becoming well known in those days, far and wide, as a persecutor of the early Christians who were known at that point as the Way. So Paul is attacking these Christians verbally, in debate, but also overseeing the physical attacking and even death of some of the members of the Way. So Paul is kind of public enemy number one for the early Christians. They are terrified of him. But he's got such incredible gifts. He is such a learned man. He has this passport to the Roman Empire. He's incredibly charismatic in some ways, but he has a deep passion for what he believes in. And that's when the story of Paul making his way on this road up to Damascus has the moment that Amanda talked about. He's on this pathway, this walked road, and he has this blinding light that arrests him where he is. He can't see for 3 days. Jesus says, "Saul, why are you persecuting me and my followers?" And he's known, of course, as Saul at this point. From that point on, Paul spends some time in Damascus, but he also ends up spending around 12 years in this time period where he is understanding more about what it means to be a Jew who is moved more now in line with Jesus. And he is understanding now that his role as a follower of Jesus, like the other apostles commissioned to go and preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, he takes this role very seriously. So Paul spends a lot of time in this whole area. He goes into this area known as Arabia and Syria. It probably includes parts of Egypt even. He's spending time understanding. It's sort of like when Jesus goes into the wilderness for his 40 days of temptation, or when the Israelites are in the wilderness for 40 years before they can enter the promised land. This is Paul's 40-year period, except it takes place over about 12 years, and he is just getting ready for the mission, the journeys, the ministry that will be ahead for him. So, after about 12 years, he has some folks that have joined him now, including a guy named Barnabas and a guy named John Mark. John Mark is also the one who will be later credited with writing the gospel according to Mark. So this trio ends up saying, okay, let's take this message beyond our hometowns and the area that we are most familiar with. And so they embark on what becomes known as Paul's first missionary journey. Here's where they go. They go from this area down here at the docks at Sidon, and they make their way over to Cyprus. Excuse me, I said that wrong. They start up here in Antioch. They go down here to Cyprus. They make 3 different stops before they go over here into this area called Asia Minor. And they end up going up to this other place called Antioch. This is called, in the Bible, this is called Antioch of Pisidia, as opposed to Syrian Antioch, which is over here in Syria. So they go to this Antioch, then they go to Iconium, then Lystra, as Stephen read about, and then down to Derbe. And then they start little house churches there. This is, they are meeting with people. They are telling them about Jesus. There's early converts to the faith. They're very excited about what they are learning about. There's probably some baptisms happening. And they start little tiny faith communities. And so it talks about in the Bible like they planted churches in those places, but don't think about that as like breaking ground and building a wooden structure or a clay structure. This is house churches, small communities, very fragile in their existence, but very excited about what they have learned about. And these people are almost exclusively Jewish by background. But what they find out here is that there are also Gentiles, aka non-Jews, sometimes referred to in the Bible as Greeks. And these people are also very curious about this message from Paul. They want to know more. They want to grow in this faith too. Tell us about what we need to do to become like you. And so there's this debate. Well, do you have to become a Jew before you can become a Jewish Christian? Or can you just go right to the Christian part? Do the men need to be circumcised like all Jewish boys and men before they can be true believers? And so these questions start to pop up. Anyway, the trio retrace their steps and they go back, all the way back down now to Jerusalem. And in the year 49, bear in mind that Jesus' resurrection was around the year 33. In 49, we have what's known as the Jerusalem Council, or the First Jerusalem Council. And that is the meeting of all of the bigwigs in the tradition of the Way. And they come together and they start to have these conversations like, what does it mean to be a Christian? Can Gentiles become Christians, or is this just a Jewish thing? If we do have converts, do they have to be circumcised before they can be believers if they're men? And so these kind of questions pop up, and they're dealing with the nuts and bolts of the early Christian tradition. What ends up happening at the council is that they say, you know what? We can set aside some of those things, and we will not insist that any of the Greek Gentile folks become circumcised before they can be a part of the Way. But we are going to hold fast to a couple of very important rules. First rule is that if you go into any of these places, any of these territories, and there are Gentiles who want to become believers, they will have to give up the practice of eating any meat that was dedicated to a pagan god or to an idol. Okay, so that's rule number one. Second rule is if they are living lives where they are practicing all kinds of sexual fornication, that has to end. And if there are any animals that they end up eating that were either killed by strangulation or the animal ends up sitting in its own blood when the food is prepared, those are no-goes. Can't do that either. So as long as we follow these sexuality rules, these dietary rules, and the rule about not eating food that was previously sacrificed or given to an idol, then we're good to go. And so what happens is Paul and Barnabas have an argument about John Mark. Those two guys decide they're not going to participate anymore, and Paul says, fine, I am going to take now a different guy, and I'm going to take a fellow named Silas, and we are going to leave from the council in Jerusalem, and we are going to take the land route this time. And we're going to go back and we're going to visit the churches that we saw before, back to Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia. And they're on this way, and while they're in Lystra, they encounter a woman who has a son. She's a Jewish woman, and the boy's dad is a Gentile. So interestingly enough, they pick up this boy. His name is Timothy, and he is interested in following Paul and Silas on this journey as well. What I think is notable about this is that this is the first time that we have somebody who, because of the Jerusalem Council, is now eligible to be a part of this movement. And as they go on and grow communities, establish churches, talk to other believers, baptize people into the faith, now they have someone who is part Gentile, part Jew, a foot in both worlds, which is, I think, really ideal for reaching out and introducing the faith to new people. So now this trio takes off, and they want to go up into this area of Asia. But Paul receives a message from the Holy Spirit that says, don't go up there. And later on, another message from Jesus and the Spirit saying, stay out of some of this area too. And they end up kind of skirting this boundary and ending up here in this area, in this town called Troas. Now, Troas is where our story begins today that Stephen read to you a moment ago. This whole region right here, in Paul's time, was called the region of Troas, aka Troy. Remember the story of Helen of Troy, the Trojan Wars, Homer writing the Iliad? That's all based here in ancient Troy, which is about 10 miles today from ancient Troas. And Troas was at an important spot because it had really large docks, and it became the launching point to send ships out into the Aegean Sea. And so this area of Troas became a center of commerce. It had a massive wall that surrounded the city. It was a great harbor, great protection, great fortified establishment up on top of a small mountain, and it became a strategic location, so much so that Julius Caesar thought hard about relocating the capital of the Roman Empire to Troas. That's how significant this place was. And Paul and his companions landed there And that's where we pick up our story today. So let's watch a short video. I'm going to give you a little glimpse into what modern or ancient Troas looks like today. So that's a glimpse at ancient Troas as it stands today. Now, one of the other noteworthy things about this city is that Luke is credited with not only writing the Gospel according to Luke, but also the book of Acts. And in this chapter that Stephen read earlier, when Paul and Silas and Timothy end up in Troas, Luke starts using we when describing the journey as it takes place from there. So it's very possible that Luke was living in Troas at the time, practicing medicine there, and decided to join these three on their party as they continued throughout this missionary journey. So now we have 4 individuals that are participating in this. Now, this is a lot of background and a lot of setup because I wanted to make sure we covered some of the first missionary journey and getting us to Troas. And there's very little said about Troas, particularly in this part of the story. But what happens here that I think is so significant, and what I want to talk about for the remainder of our time this morning, is about Paul's vision. It says that when they arrived in Troas, during the night, Paul had a vision, where in the vision he saw a man from Macedonia, that is, someone on the other side of the Aegean Sea. And he pleaded with Paul, please come and help us. And when Paul awoke from the vision, he gathered the 3 others and said, it's time to leave. They walked down that same stone pathway down to the harbor. They got in a ship and they sailed over to Macedonia, which is where we'll pick up our story next week. But I was moved as I was reading this story again about the conviction that Paul had. I mean, look, to be fair, Paul was struck blind for 3 days by a powerful light, and he heard the voice of Jesus, as did those who were present with him on the road to Damascus. Paul also has Jesus in his ear telling him to go on these missionary journeys. Paul has Jesus and the Holy Spirit in his ear saying, avoid these places and go to these places. So for Paul, he seems to have a line of communication with the Holy Spirit or with Christ that may be different than the way that you have experienced the Spirit and Jesus in your life. And yet many of us are familiar with that tug on our hearts, that familiar kind of call in our lives that is leading us in a particular direction, or to hold back in a certain circumstance, or the idea that we move into an unknown kind of phase of our life or territory, not knowing what is going to happen, but being asked to trust in the process. As we've talked about before, this happens sometimes naturally in our lives, and it may not be necessarily a matter of faith. But those times when you take those leaps, you try on a new career because the old one is no longer working for you. You embark upon a kind of a relationship with somebody who you don't know where this is going to go, but this feels like the next right thing to do. Or perhaps maybe there's a move that causes you to move out of the community that you have always known. Or you enroll in a college or a university where you feel like this is a whole new experience and a whole new world that I'm entering into. I remember when I was 17 years old, that's where at a church camp I felt as powerfully as I could possibly imagine God speaking something into my heart saying, I'd like you to follow me in such a way that you will also lead other people. I want you to be a pastor. And it wasn't a voice like a Damascus voice from the clouds above kind of a voice, but I knew it as crystal clear as if it had happened that way. But it meant that I was going to be entering into a kind of life that I didn't fully understand. I did not feel well equipped in my understanding of the Bible. I had not had a single class in theology. I was an 11th grader. These things were unfamiliar to me. I just knew that I grew up in the church. I had been baptized. I'd gone through confirmation. I was a member of my youth group. But that was the extent of my preparedness for this moment. And yet something in me knew that this was what was the next step. And I remember talking to my pastor at the time and telling him what had happened. And he wasn't surprised to hear this, which I guess was of some comfort to me. But I said, what do I do next? And he said, finish high school. Well, yeah, but then what? Well, go on and continue your studies. Study something that you're interested in college. After that, we'll talk about seminary. And then we'll take the next step. But we'll take this one thing at a time. Do not be projecting what will be out there 10 years from now when you're sitting here as a junior in high school. Just take it slow. One step at a time. I think it's the only advice that he could have offered. And it was the right advice for me. On Monday, a number of our 4th and 5th graders, combined with several other churches, as you heard Amanda talking about and as we've been promoting over the past few weeks, but finally on Monday, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we had this group of kids who went from our church and joined other United Methodist churches, and they went down to the historically African American church of St. Paul United Methodist downtown, right next to 16th Street Baptist. They went to the Civil Rights Institute. They learned about Martin Luther King Jr. and what they were trying to wrap their heads around is, okay, so we're 4th and 5th graders. How do we make an impact? What is our role in making the world a more just place? How do we have healing of racial relationships and this legacy that has been so damaging? And the answer is, you do one thing at a time. You take a small step. Or as the phrase has become more commonplace, you do the next right thing. When I look at Paul, and I look at Silas, and Timothy, and now Luke, what were they called to do? They didn't know. All they knew was what the next thing was that they were supposed to do. Where are we going tomorrow? And how are we going to have an impact today? They weren't worried about how this was all going to play out. They just did the next thing along the way. And I think that that's one of the hardest things, simplest things, but the hardest things for us to learn in our Christian journey is how do we practice that same kind of thing? We see the world's needs. We see the hurt. We see the hardship. We see the challenges that we face. We see the injustices around us, and we want to fix them. We want to do something about it. We want to take action, and we should. But the only things that we can do is act today, plan for tomorrow, do the next right thing. It's the way that we get through life. It's the way we move through every single challenge that we face. And as we look at these stories in these missionary journeys of Paul, we see that the same thing holds true over and over again. Minister to your current context. Do what you can today. Take one step at a time and do the next right thing. And that doesn't matter if you're a junior in high school like I was, you're a fourth or fifth grader on a church field trip, or you're in retirement and wondering about what is my role as a follower of Jesus today. You make a difference where you are. You move on to the next thing and do the next right thing along the way. And God will guide us through this process. That's what we're going to find out next Sunday as we cross the Aegean and we end up in Macedonia. And this man who came to Paul in a vision takes a very different form by the time that Paul and his companions get to the other side of the sea. We'll talk about that next week. But I invite you now to pray with me as we consider what it is that God is calling us to do this next step.